Those who don't know, my name's Jonathan Mickey. I'm president of Callow College. So, for those of you who haven't been here before, welcome to the college. My task here as president is to introduce the facilitator this evening, Morgan, and then Morgan will introduce the speakers. Morgan was captain of the University of Nottingham women's football team, but is now at Oxford doing a DPhil, and it's part of a public engagement project in Oxford involving researchers and football communities to understand more about how our brains are involved in football, called Football on the Brain. So Morgan will explain a bit more about that in a minute. I feel slightly embarrassed introducing an event on International Women's Day, but I was told I should do because not many heads of colleges are interested in football, and I was very involved. When Rupert Murdoch tried to buy Manchester United, I was very involved in the campaign to try and prevent that, which I can please say was successful. But at the time, I was always slightly reluctant to talk about football even then, because I was a bit blokish, and so I always had to sort of apologise and explain that I only got interested in football because of my wife. My wife from what she says is the worst part of Manchester, Clyde, whose only claim to fame was one of the Moors murderers was from there. But then they got Harold Shipman, who was actually her mum's doctor, but luckily her mum survived it. Doctor, and it was actually a condition of marriage that I had to become a Manchester United supporter, because her dad's idea of helping with the childcare was to take her and her sister to Old Trafford for every home game. So they grew up as Manchester United fanatics, and it was a condition of marriage that I had to. So it was a bit like a dowry system. Actually, I had to buy a season ticket for Manchester United, and buy one for her, and buy one for her dad. So we used to go, and then Rupert tried to take over the club. So I, along with Michael Crick, the investigative journalist, launched this campaign to prevent the takeover, which was successful. And then we tried to mutualise the club, get the supporters to buy shares. I was the chair of the Sheffield United Against Murdoch, it was called, and then Sheffield was the Manchester United Trust. And we did also set up Supporters Direct, which was encouraging football supporters at all clubs to take a stake in the club and get on the board and have a voice. So actually I was with so we went to every home game, and I did go to the away game at Sheffield Wednesday, when they were getting relegated, and Howard Shipman was actually on trial at the time. So I remember the Manchester United supporters all singing "You're Going Down" with Howard Shipman. Sadly, both were true. So anyway, Morgan, over to you.
Yeah. My name's Morgan. I'm a second year PhD student. Grew up playing football. I don't play football seriously anymore. I coach an under-15s team. That's keeping me busy. And also involved in a project called Football on the Brain, which I'll talk about a little bit afterwards. I think someone's going to ask me some questions about it, so I'll be ready for that. Anyone in the audience. But so I'll introduce our panel, and then we'll, I think, get on to our discussion. Sitting next to me here, we've got Maddy. I've written it down as well. I really don't want to forget what they do. Maddy's currently the president of the Universities Association Football Club, which encompasses both the men and women's sides. And she was captain of the Blues team, having had played semi-professional football in Australia before coming to Oxford. So we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that and your experiences throughout our discussion. Then we have Alexa, who grew up playing football in London, actually at one of the same clubs as me, which is really interesting, at Charlton Athletic, which at the time was called still Croydon, was it?
Croydon first, and then we amalgamated into Charlton. Yeah.
Nice. And her football skills awarded her call up to playing for England at international across lots of different teams and age groups and things like that. So we look forward to hearing more about your experiences and things like that throughout the discussion as well. And then we have AJ, I've got this all written down because I really don't want to forget this. Personal trainer, CrossFit coach, sports therapist, and Olympic weightlifting coach. So like a proper sports fitness multi-hyphenate, basically.
I think you're trying to have nothing to do with football, but I run a business that supports young girls who feel disengaged with physical activity and try to encourage them into it.
Great stuff. And that's
I've got
called
all those other quals as well, but
and that's called the project.
we're called the Project PT. Yeah.
Perfect. So we'll hear a little bit more about that as well. So I guess just to kick us off then, like first question for everyone, and is basically just why football? Like what about football caught your attention, or how did you first get into playing football?
How should we go?
Hi, I'm Maddy. So I grew up in Australia, and I first got into football kind of by accident because my family were big Australian rules supporters. My grandfather played professionally as an Australian rules footballer, but at the time there was nothing available for young girls in Australian rules football, and I went to watch one of my cousin's football games, and I thought it was so cool how they were kicking the ball around without touching it with their hands, and I decided that I wanted to join the local football team, and I grew up playing club football with the boys until I transitioned to more elite level pathways when I was about 12, and yeah, pretty random, but once I started I didn't want to stop, so yeah, that's how I got into it.
Nice.
Thanks. Hi everyone. I guess like most people who love a sport, I kind of, as soon as I saw a football or could walk, I started kicking a football around, and that continued throughout my life. I guess we're going to go deeper into that, but I would just play anywhere. So I'd play on my own, I'd play in the house, I'd set up a little mini obstacle course and run around my upstairs playing football with a tennis ball. I'd play on the street and have to dodge cars, or I'd play with friends, and yeah, it kind of never stopped since. I'll pass you on.
So although I said I had nothing to do with football, it was the only game we were allowed to play at school. So we were allowed to play with a tennis ball, and we could play every break and every lunchtime, and so I played with the boys because that was the only option. And but it wasn't an option for us to play in a team, so there were no teams for me to go join, so I had to fight my way to be able to play cricket instead, because that was a sport that girls were just about allowed to play.
Nice. And I guess, Alexa, you said you'd go a little bit deeper into your experiences playing football and things like that. I'm just interested in sort of how you got into like more higher level football, and I guess what were the difficulties in that pathway, considering like, I guess we've heard there are not many teams and having to split off from playing with boys as well at age 12. I think that we all have that in common. Yeah, I guess what were the specific, if there were any specific difficulties playing football as a young girl or woman, and how do you think that compares to like the men's game at the time that you were playing?
To answer the last part first, there was no comparison. We were an afterthought, pretty much. We didn't have a platform to thrive at that time, and because of that, a lot of women left the game early, unfortunately, who could have gone on to, I'm sure, great things. I didn't realise I could play for a team until I was about 13 or 14, and I was playing in Streatham Common on my own, doing some kick-ups, and Hope Powell, who some of you will know went on to manage England, walked past and asked me who I played for, and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And she convinced me that I should come and play for her team, which was Croydon. So I joined Croydon, and that was my kind of pathway in. Previous to that, I think I'd played one tournament for a primary school boys team, in which after the first 2 games I was disqualified from playing because the other boys teams didn't want me to be playing because I was too good. And we were winning too easily. I think the first few years I was playing, I just was so happy that I was allowed now, and I'd found this space where I could just be, and I could train and I could play, and I was being recognised for my talents, and it was wonderful. As time went by and I got older, I think I began to think more about the differences between the women's game and the men's game. We would just think of some examples. We'd go away to England under 16s or under 18s games. We'd all pile into one car, 5 of us, and when we got there, we wouldn't receive any money or anything like that, but we'd receive petrol expenses. We'd all pretend that we'd driven our own cars, and we'd make up lots of different stops along the way to increase the mileage so we could get just a couple more quid. So that was kind of the only remunification we received for playing for a hell of a long time. We wore men's kits as 16, 15-year-olds, all the way through to when I was playing for the older age group. The training facilities were, substandard. When I played for Charlton, we would play after the kind of the under 14, 15 boys would play, so we'd play late at night. I wouldn't get home until kind of 11:30 at night, so I lived the other side of London or through a load of traffic. So it was there was no comparison. Although I enjoyed it and I had a great time, it was hard work sometimes.
How do you think that impacted your trajectory through the sport? Like, all of those things to me are sounding like barriers and hurdles that I guess are even now not comparable to where women's sport is now, and women's football particularly. I guess you obviously have played at a high level, but how do you think that those barriers specifically affected your trajectory at the time?
I think a lot of my friends went on and played to, got hundreds of caps for England and played to an extremely high level and had that same experience as me. So I don't want to sit here and say that it was just awful for me and I couldn't make it for just those reasons. I think I found it hard because I was particularly shy. I still am, so this is quite hard for me. And at that time, I was offered various different scholarships, one of which I took up, which was at Loughborough. I was offered a scholarship in America, but I was extremely shy and nervous, and I didn't want to go and take that opportunity. I feel that more support around that for me as a person would have been brilliant, and I think in the male game, I probably might have received that support. I suffered an injury to my ankle, and there was very little support in terms of just turning up and putting a bit of ice on it. Which kind of left you injured for a far longer time than you would need to be. So there was things like that which affected the trajectory that I kind of would have had. I feel. Yeah.
And I think it's interesting. You straight away were like, oh, it's it's me. I'm maybe that kind of person. I don't want to say it's like just affected my trajectory, but I mean, it feels like, or it sounds like there was only like a few that made it out of that system into like long sustainable careers, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can think of so many women that I played with and who I have no idea what they do now, but were wonderful footballers, had an immense amount of talent, but had to go and pay the mortgage and had to go to work 5-6 days a week and whatever it was, and it was difficult. I guess moving out of home when I was playing for England, so I was working various different jobs, was coming home late on a Sunday after spending a weekend in Doncaster or wherever it was on a coach and arriving home at 1 in the morning and then getting up and trying to go to work wherever it was. I can't remember because it was so long ago. But yeah, it wasn't easy, I think, for a lot of women, and there wasn't light at the end of the tunnel. And we didn't feel appreciated. We didn't feel like many people cared or that actually it was going to change. I think when I was younger, when I was 5, 6, 7 years old, if you would have asked me what I wanted to be when I was older, I would have said a footballer. I think by the time I was playing football, I knew that just wasn't a thing, and it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's super interesting because I think, like, even when I was playing football and sort of exiting academies or whatever, it felt like a almost forced decision, like, as in it doesn't look like there's a sustainable career ahead of you. Like, I think I knew a lot of women who were playing who had to have 2 jobs. Like, there were teachers, there were, medics, physios, whatever it is, who were still also managing like a professional career. It just didn't feel like an option. Like, and I guess it feels as though you have to go on to pick something else perhaps that is going to, help you pay the bills and things like that. I guess I'm interested, Maddy, as well, to maybe hear about your experience and maybe if the difficulties were similar, perhaps because I guess you were talking about the Australian system a little bit more, whether you had any difficulties like growing up playing football, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what you do at the uni.
Sure. I grew up playing in academies, and I played when I was 14 in the elite pathway in Australia, and I think generally speaking I came into football just when things were like beginning to change for women and things were being taken more seriously, especially in the developmental phase. I think when I was about 12, Australia started trying to bid for the World Cup, which they failed for the men's, but they ended up getting it for the women's last year. And I think that made a massive change to the approach to football in the country in terms of people and the FFA wanting to invest in soccer in Australia in order to be able to make Australia appealing to an international stage and welcoming people to our country for a big footballing event. So I think I was lucky that like my age kind of coincided with that movement. I think in most of the clubs I played, there were still pretty big disadvantages between the men's teams and the women's teams, especially in terms of what pitches we got to train on, for example. The women's teams usually got moved to the worst of pitches, while the men's got the nice artificial or beautiful grass pitches. And I think a lot of the sexism I experienced in football growing up was especially to do with academies that had boys and girls players. And a lot of it, to be honest, was from coaches and coaches who valued their boys players a lot more than their girls players, no matter how much better you trained or played. And even coaches who did value your talent and saw you as really like potentially successful footballers, still there'd always be a throwaway comment that was just like a bit disheartening in terms of how they were viewing me differently to boys players. Things like being asked about whether I could chest the ball or not, and just like comments like that. When you're like 14, 15 growing up in football, it does start to grate, and eventually like it does make you not feel welcome in the space anymore. And I think that's something that I really struggled with growing up, and something that my parents really, really pushed me in. Especially my mum was always very encouraging of me to occupy those spaces and make myself heard, even if people maybe didn't want me there because I was a girl. I had to keep showing up and keep proving myself. But yeah, it was hard work. Yeah.
And I mean, I guess you're doing that in your role now. Like, you're president of the football club here, which covers both like the women's and men's teams. Do you still feel like some of those difficulties and barriers that you faced when you were growing up playing football still persist? I mean, still persist now in what's quite a traditionalist uni. So like, generally male-dominated spaces are hard for women to occupy.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the football club merged the men's and women's in 2020, which was a really big change for the club, because it meant that equal funding was a promise for both the men's and the women's sides. So the women got access to all-weather training pitches and, generally speaking, much improved facilities, coaching, training, etc. And so I was very lucky that my first year at the uni coincided with that merger. But I think that OUAFC is probably one of the clubs at the university that's a really good example of positive change to do with funding in women's sport at the uni. A lot of clubs are still separate men's and women's clubs, and usually it's the men's club who receive the vast majority of that funding, and the women's clubs who are really struggling to survive. So I think one of the big things in uni sport, especially at a very conservative traditionalist uni like Oxford, is that we need to band together. We need the clubs to work for each other. It can't just be to leave the women's clubs on their own to raise their own money and get things together. I think we really benefit from clubs coming together and pooling our resources in order to make sport more accessible to everyone.
And is that working in practice? Like, I only ask, is that actually working in practice? Because like often things like that happen generally as kind of like, oh, we're trying, and actually like things don't really filter through and stuff like that. So I guess one, does that actually work in practice? And two, do you think the university is gaining traction in that becoming more commonplace for other clubs? I mean, you might not know, but just an interesting point.
I think the nature of university sport and university clubs is that there is a huge amount of turnover in leadership. So every year there's a new president, there's a new committee, and it really depends on who the leader is to carry on the vision, I guess, especially in terms of things like equal funding for men's and women's sport. I think in my time as president, that's been one of my main goals, that I've tried really hard to ensure that the equal teams get equal funding. So men's blues, women's blues get the same, men's twos, women's twos get the same. And I think generally speaking, there is still some adjustments to be made, especially in terms of expectations. I think that when clubs merge, sometimes there's a bit of an adjustment period because men's teams perhaps will lose out a little bit on what they used to have in order to make it a bit more even, to give the women more of a chance, and that often is quite a big adjustment period, and that can be a bit difficult, especially with players and coaches, especially in the higher teams, who are expecting a certain standard, and sometimes it's difficult when you're a woman president and you feel like you have to justify to men's teams why women should get access to the same facilities. But I think it's really important that we have people like Heidi Johansson-Berg, who you work with on Football on the Brain, who's the senior member at OUAFC, and she's acts as like a very consistent person who'll be there for 5 years, and so she's someone who we can pass that vision on to and make sure that when each year we get new turnover in committee, she can make sure that the committee is aware that that's what the club is striving for into the future.
Amazing. Love that from Heidi. So AJ, just to come to you a little bit, you're not perhaps directly involved in football or playing football yourself, but you work with young people, young women and girls, basically trying to create a space for those who like find the gym and fitness hard to access. So what barriers do you see more generally in the growth to women's sport?
It's just countless. I'm still surprised that we're having a conversation and having to explain to one gender why another gender deserves equality.
A pitch.
A space and stuff. The barriers that we see are endless. So at the Project PT, we've got several different things that we do. One of them is trying to engage with teenage girls who feel alienated, feel disenfranchised from participating in sports, so particularly when they're going from that primary school into secondary school. The largest barrier to those, or the most sort of consistent thing to those girls participating, is actually their support networks do not participate in fitness. So that's the key thing, which is a big challenge for us, because we can work with the young girls, we can work with secondary schools, but actually how do we work with their support networks, with their parents, with their carers? That's a large challenge for us. So that's the first key thing, is that we need to support there. The second thing is dismantling those gender stereotypes. We did a research project 3 years ago now, and we were asked by Active Oxfordshire, which is a partnership arm of Sport England, to go and find out what are the barriers, what are the enablers to young girls participating in fitness. And they wanted us to do a research project. We're not research people. Alexa owns the Project PT with me, and neither of us have finished university, I'm afraid to say, in this room. But my key thing was that how can I ask a young girl what her enablers and barriers are to fitness, why she doesn't want to participate in football, boxing, skateboarding, if she's never even tried it? If she hasn't tried it in the first place, then how will she know what are those barriers, what's stopping me from doing it? So instead of doing a research project, probably how you guys would do it, we just put them in front of a load of sports, and we gave them the support that we knew that they needed in order to be able to participate in them. So we had girls who we'd been told by their teachers don't like fitness, doesn't participate, comes in with the PE note to say, nope, not doing it, haven't got my kit. And we got them skateboarding, we got them boxing, we kind of got them weightlifting, not too much, they didn't like that as much. But they loved the boxing and they loved the skateboarding. I think one of the reasons they enjoyed it, or we know one of the reasons they enjoyed it, was because those sports were scary. They were a little bit dangerous. They were also not allowed for them, right? Skateboarding, you're going to go down the park, who are you going to see? You're going to see a load of boys. That's going to be a scary space. Boxing, who does boxing? Boys do boxing. The other reasons they enjoyed those sports wasn't just sort of that dismantling of those stereotypes, it was actually because they were individual sports as well. So one thing that the girls don't enjoy doing is they don't enjoy participating in a sport where their ability to do the sport is directly going to affect another person's enjoyment of that sport. So if we provide them with an opportunity to be able to do individual sports, they're going to enjoy it more. So we're currently working with Oxford County Council on providing a much bigger climbing wall so they can participate in that. We'd like to be able to offer trampolining and stuff, but I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, I guess. But I guess coming back to your question, the barriers are that they can't do it. There's not an opportunity for them to be able to do it. And then there are just numerous other ones that I could carry on for, but I've probably not got the airtime, so I'll throw it back to you.
Well, I was going to just ask a very, very quick question. In terms of so how do you see empowering these young girls, women through sport and movement? How do you think that impacts their interaction with society more generally?
It gives them community, first of all, and if we have community, we feel stronger, right? So that's the first thing. In terms of what do the teachers report to us, they report seeing a difference in their behaviour in the classroom. They report seeing just a difference in their confidence in the way that they held themselves, in terms of their ability to challenge themselves as well. So they're willing to try then other sports because all of a sudden one of the sports worked for them. So hell, I'll try another one as well. I think there are countless. The reports that we get from the schools is mostly based on their confidence and a change in their behaviour as well, because all of a sudden I feel confident, I feel good about myself, so I can communicate better.
Well, thank God for the Project PT. I guess thinking about the current state of play for women's football at the moment then, I guess we're fans and you still play. What do you think is the current state of play compared to when you grew up playing football? I guess we'll start with Alexa and then Maddy, you can throw in.
I think obviously right now it's a really great time for women's football, especially at the top level. They're being recognised, household names, there's great sponsorship deals. I think what's important is not forgetting those lower leagues and the 5 or 6 teams who are at the top that everyone knows and who have those household names, not forgetting the teams that are below them as well as the other divisions. And just remembering that there's still a massive load of work to do for the younger generations and the primary school girls playing or not playing, and like AJ was just saying, how can we get them involved and make them feel that it is their space? And there's still a lot to be done when it comes to that.
I was just going to say, how do you think that how football is represented in the media will change that? And is there enough sort of positive media representation of women's football at the minute?
What's that?
Yes and
AJ's
no.
ready
Yes,
to
I
go
know.
on.
But, I guess there's a bit of both. Have you got something you want to add?
No. Okay, go on.
Not yet, but I guess you answer it with AJ as well.
I think there's far more representation, isn't there? And that's a good thing. I'm sure there could still be a lot more done, a lot more words written in the right way.
I'll jump
go
in.
on, you jump in. Savoury.
I think we're still treating women exactly the same as we do in terms of their acting careers, in terms of their corporate life. We're still talking about what women are wearing when they're turning up to the football awards. We're still objectifying the women in a totally different way to the way that we objectify men. So there's still a huge shift that needs to happen there in wider society, not just in terms of the media and in football. I think that women, there's an element of equality coming, but we're married as well. We didn't tell you that. We have 2 young boys, and they collect football cards, and guess what? They're men. We've only just, I think, this year started to allow women to go onto the football cards and start to represent them there. I think there's still lots to do, and we're still, as women, receiving the same negative attention as we're receiving in lots of other areas in the world.
What do you think, Maddy, about the current state of play of football? Women's football?
I think following the World Cup in Australia, it's been an incredible development to see just how much women's football has taken off popularity-wise. I think in terms of speaking about the media, I think there's some really interesting points about players and their roles and expectations now that women's football has become so popular. When I was growing up, I remember going to Matilda's matches, that's the women's Australian team, and being like one of a couple of hundred people in the crowd. And so after the match, you'd get to meet all the players. We sometimes had players who came to training sessions with us. And these days, like, they're selling out stadiums of 80,000 people. And I think there's still some expectation on these women to kind of be like this every woman and sign all these autographs and, you know, get to around to everyone at matches. And recently there's been some criticism of women footballers who haven't been friendly enough or signed enough autographs. And I think that it's an interesting adjustment now because we're in a period where women's football has taken off so quickly, like literally in the last 5 years, it's gotten so much more popular. And we're transitioning between what we see as where women's football is going. And I think part of the problem with that is that we're comparing it so much to the men's game, how the men deal with publicity, how the men deal with the huge amounts of excessive contract money that they get paid, and trying to kind of mimic that in the women's game rather than treating it as its own space that deserves its own attention, I guess, separate to the men's game. And I think that's something that the media is like going to have to adjust to in the coming years.
And I guess I've got a question here, and it's like, are there things that still need to change in order for the women's game to grow alongside the men's game? And I think we've said that, but what are the things I think that need to change so that the women's game can really grow in a way that is sustainable alongside like the men's side of football?
I think there are some pretty basic things to do with sports science, for example, and the way we approach female athletes, taking into consideration, for example, the differences between female bodies and male bodies, the menstrual cycle, chronic illnesses that lots of women suffer with to do with having a uterus, like endometriosis or fibroids or PCOS, and how those kind of illnesses that are very specific to women impact performance. And there's not enough sports science and there's not enough research on how women's bodies react differently to for example, matches and high pressure physical activity at different points of their cycle, how women with chronic conditions like endometriosis will be impacted in performance-wise at different parts of their cycle. And I think there are some women who are starting to talk about that, like on the England national team with Leah Williamson and Beth England, who talk about playing with endometriosis. And I just think at the moment we've got so much of the research that we use to give advice to women athletes is based on research that has been done on male bodies. Mm-hmm. So one of the really important things for women's football going forward, I think, is not the gold standard doesn't have to be that women's football has to mimic men's football exactly 100% to be equal, but that we can take into consideration things that make women athletes different to men athletes. And equality doesn't necessarily look like exactly like for like men and women. It looks like equal opportunity, equal representation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the sport itself is exactly identical to the men's game. And I think perhaps sometimes a little less comparison would go a long way in developing a better like public opinion and general research on the women's game.
Alexa, what do you think? And I guess to tag on a second bit of that question is, why do you think it is so heavily compared to the men's game? Like, what's the incentive?
I'd say the incentive is for...
Clickbait.
Well, I was going to say the incentive is that the men probably don't want it to get as big as they know that it could get, potentially. I can't answer the question much better than that. I think that was wonderfully answered. I think it's important that it's the women's game choose the right funding and the right support, the right sponsorship deals going forward. Myself and AJ were discussing that in the car before she says I stole her ideas. It's a two-way conversation. But yeah, I think that's really important to create the right direction for the sport and to continue to, or to not forget those leagues below them, to continue to support those leagues, to support grassroots, and to open the doors for other sports at the same time, I think is really important. So to not just, like you said, mimic the men's game and run with it, to really consider, we have that opportunity to consider how we're going to develop the game and make it great for women.
Yeah, and I don't know, I guess just a question generally for the panel is like, in my head, I kind of see it has to be mimicked at the moment, right? Because the people investing in women's football are still men and still consume and watch men's football. So do you think, because there's also like, is it Angel City FC that are completely in the US and they're completely women owned, and the system there just seems way more sustainable and community based and things like that. Like, I guess, how do we change that? How do we start getting sort of women at the forefront who sort of are able to make decisions and pull purse strings and things like that to be at the forefront of women's football to drive it forward in a positive way?
I think the women's game's actually now got its traction. So I actually think that I think that the women's game's now in a position where it can start to ask the right questions, and it can actually, I don't think it matters that men are funding the game, because they're going to need to fund the game anyway, because it's got that traction we're going now. Yeah. So I think that women can start to ask more poignant questions, can start to demand more things out of their sponsorship deals, and can start to change things. I don't think it is about who's paying for it now. I think the game's big enough that it can do its own thing. And I think adding on to Maddy's point, which was so very, very well spoken, we need to talk about clothing. We need to talk about the fact that the women's game has only just been, we've only just stopped making women play in white shorts. We need to start talking more about periods. It needs to stop being an under the table thing. It needs to be spoken out loud. We need to talk about sports bras. We need to talk about football boots. There's loads of conversations that need to happen, and that needs to not be mimicking the men's game. That needs to be in its own. The women's game, has anyone been to a women's game? Yeah, it's beautiful, right? It's a community. It's you know, a fantastic player on the opposite side to the side that you're watching can go off, and the opposite side cheers for them because they're happy for them. We went to see England versus America, and Megan Rapinoe came off, or did she go on? I can't remember. Everyone loves her, so everyone claps. It's never going to happen in the male game at all. And that's why we need to stay in our own lane, and that's why we need to run the game how we're going to run it, because it's actually beautiful how it is.
Yeah. So just touching on that then, like there are lots of positives in women's football. Like what do we think is getting better / has changed? Yeah, I'll leave it there and then I've got another question after that. Anyone?
There you go.
I think what's changed is that, yeah, there's loads more sponsorship deals, people are making money, people are able to have conversations. You know, Jill Scott, Leah Williamson are becoming far more outspoken about what they want the game to look like. They're no longer having to just pander to what they're worried that the sponsorship deals need them to say. And the game is a completely and utterly a community space. It's where you know, children and women can go and safely watch a game. They can safely watch a derby and not be worried. Those are the fantastic positives that have come out of the game.
And go on, Maddy.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the biggest changes that has happened in the last 10 years or so is that now women can make a living out of playing football. And Alexa mentioned this at the start, but if you're having, and this isn't true for all the women's football leagues in the world in the same way that it is for men's football leagues, there are still countries where women can't make a living playing football. But I think when you give women the opportunity to dedicate a career to a sport and they don't have to be training 4 or 5 times a week and doing a job on the side, then there is you create that space where women can speak out and can start conversations in a public sphere in a way that I don't think women necessarily had the time to do before, because it wasn't just about being a footballer. It was about being a footballer as well as, you know, having another job being a doctor. I played with girls who worked full-time jobs or and on the side were playing professional level football, and that's not the standard anymore. Now women can, if they get to a certain level, make a living playing football. And I think what Alexis said is really important about the lower leagues and not forgetting those, and the way that, for example, in the UK, men can be professional footballers and get a pretty decent wage all the way down to like the 3rd division or so, whereas in women's it's very much like the Premier League or the WSL, and like
Nothing else.
if that the proper good paying players in that are very much in the top teams in, you know, the top positions. So it's still a long way to go, but I think that is something that's changed, that has allowed more airtime to women's football.
Amazing. One last question, and I think we have time to go to Q&A from the audience. So I guess to both of you or everyone, in an ideal world, money, time, no object or issue, what would you like to see happen within the sphere of women's football, and how would you like to see it grow?
I would say the research to be done, money spent on that, so understanding the female body, how that affects the way that we play and the way that we train, and again just echoing those points of it being fully inclusive in terms of not just those top teams but all the way down the league, everyone getting a piece of the pie and everyone being able to enjoy the sport and that they love playing day after day, and not have to kind of worry about whatever work or whatever else they need to do at the end of the day. I don't know what I'm saying. I'll pass it on to you.
What was the question?
So
In an ideal
world, money and time are no object or issue. what would you like to see happen within the sphere of women's football, and how would you like to see it grow?
I think I'd like to see women be able to make choices about their bodies and it not be a newspaper article. I'd like them to be able to go have a baby and not be judged and go back to their sport and play again. Not to be asked, how are you coping with motherhood and playing a sport at the same time? I think I'd just like to see those sorts of changes in the narrative that's spun through the media and in the questions that are asked.
And Maddy?
I think for me the biggest thing is involving women from a young age at grassroots level and keeping women in football. And I think one of the really important things for us to encourage girls, especially teenage girls, to stay in the sport is getting away from the dialogue of comparing women and men in football, and really just building a space where women and young girls feel like football is a thing that they should be doing and that's worthwhile doing, and they have all these role models that they can look up to now that like I didn't have when I was growing up playing football, and that wasn't that long ago. So I think like this is such a great opportunity right now for us to harness the positive changes that have happened in the last 5-10 years and make sure that they keep multiplying over the next 10-20 years.
Awesome. What a great panel. Okay, so we're going to open up to the audience. So I guess if you put your hand up if you've got a question. Judith? Someone should come round to you with a mic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a question to you, Morgan, before we forget, because I think you can tell us about Football on the Brain, the wonderfully named project that you're involved in. Can you tell us about it?
Yep, so Football on the Brain is a project that's run up. I work at the Wellcome Centre for Integrative Neuroimaging. So we're a group of neuroscientists that have put together this project that uses football as a vehicle to present neuroscience research, basically. And the idea behind that is to help us try and engage people who are not generally seeking out the university in any other sort of public engagement events, basically, and reach different types of audiences. So we work across sort of fan bases, coaches and players. And the idea is basically that we think the brain's really cool and we want lots of people to know more about the brain. So we're sort of developing alongside coaches education for young footballers, for them to know a little bit more about the brain, how they can harness that in them learning a new skill, for example, like football. With fans, it would be more about engaging them in neuroscience research that applies to their lifestyle. So perhaps they think about taking on more positive lifestyle habits and things like that. And then with other coaches, it's a case of thinking about how we can empower them to use the knowledge of the brain in their coaching practice, basically. So we work with a range of different partners in that. There are some community-based partners, one being Oxford in the Community, Oxford City, and Ignite, who are sort of an education provider within those club structures. We also work with a big charity called Football Beyond Borders, who basically use football with kids who are at risk of being excluded from school as a way to teach them some more sort of socio-emotional skills so that they can basically cope with the demands of school. And we also work with She Kicks, which is a magazine that is designed for young girls who are interested in football. So we've provided some like print media on that, and we do some interesting sort of covers and special issues basically to talk about some current issues in football and engage young fans through that. And I'm going to forget someone, but I feel like that might be it. So we try and basically work across a range of different groups and diverse groups rather, but having the brain at the centre of that, and that football is a vehicle to sort of explain these neuroscience concepts. Someone.
nations around the world where, of course, women aren't allowed to play football, and certainly they can't put forward women's teams to play in international competitions. And I'm just wondering how you would try and tackle that. Would you try and persuade FIFA not to allow the men's team to compete unless they also have a women's team who can compete?
Sounds like a good idea.
It does sound like a very good idea. I don't know if you could persuade FIFA to do very much, to be honest. But has anyone else got an answer?
Yeah, I was just going to say I wouldn't trust FIFA to do that well. I think, like, especially with the recent Men's World Cup in Qatar, I think that they showed that it didn't seem to be that important to them about women's rights, human rights generally, and that it's completely fine to host a World Cup in a country that doesn't respect women's right to, you know, drive or do basic things independently. So I think that it's a lot more powerful when that kind of change comes from within the community itself rather than the international organisation at large. I think in terms of women's football and women's sport more generally, it's always helpful when the men support women in being able to get access to sport. Unfortunately, that isn't always the case, and in a lot of countries, especially where there are cultural barriers to women participating in sport, it seems very unlikely that men's teams would in fact support their fellow female athletes to compete at the same level. I think for countries where there are big cultural gaps that are preventing women engaging in sport, I think there's like a lot of complicated things that need to be considered in terms of how you can change that. And the basic thing for me, I think, would be investment in grassroots sport and getting children and girls involved in sport as early as possible to make it seem normal, so that the next generation growing up of men, for example, has grown up playing football with girls and boys, and so it's not so weird for them to think that there might be a women's team alongside a men's team. So I think that would be the way that I would tackle it personally.
Oh, sounds good. Anyone? You?
Great answer. Yeah, I think it's more about education than punitive measures. I think we know from our justice system that punitive measures don't work, and that actually education and support is the way forward. So I think your answer was right.
I think I'm really curious about what do you think about the relationship between talents and interests? Because it seems like talents play an important role in sports. For example, when you played as a role as a coach, if some children they are not good. They seem like don't have talents for some sports, for weightlifting, but they really work hard. Yeah, will you just encourage them or tell them the truth? And it seems like sometimes I will be good at something and then I come to be interested to love it. Or sometimes I really love something, but I'm not good at it. So I really wonder, how do you think about the relationship between talents and interests, or proficiency and interests? Thank you.
I think that's a really good question. I think, just trying to unpack in my head, I think within football, or just women's football or sport generally, I think the idea is trying to untangle that relationship between talent or proficiency and interest. I think, I don't know, from a neuroscience perspective, we should just be encouraging people to enjoy movement, like whether they're good or bad at it. And I think that's something I guess you only become better at doing once you've sort of broken the seal and done it a few times and just failed at things and been bad at things. And I think because generally playing football, at least how my experience of it is, that it can be quite elitist. We're probably the only country that has like under 7 academies, within Europe I should say, under 7 academies right the way up to under 23s. And in my opinion, there's just kind of no need for it. We try and make young people good at football and like only take the most talented, which kind of, when you look at it, sort of the percentage of those that go on to make it into professional sports is something like 0.1%, and that's on the men's side, where there's money, proficiency, there's money, there's provisions, there's all of these different things to try and make that happen. And I think we probably should switch to a model where we just encourage young people to move and encourage young people to enjoy sports. I think other countries in Europe, thinking about the Netherlands, Germany, Spain, Portugal, you end up playing lots of other different sports growing up. So you don't sort of specialise super early. Like you play hockey, you play basketball, you play tennis, you play football and swim alongside all of that and become better movers. And generally they go on to play sports throughout their lifetime. There isn't this sort of drain of those who are, I don't know, not as good, or there's no pressure to be super talented at those sports. The idea is to enjoy an active lifestyle. So I think there probably is a relationship in this country between sort of only those that are good go on to sort of enjoy sports and get better at them. But I think we probably should try and untangle that a bit more and have a bit more of a holistic model.
Yeah, we sort of taking it away from football and talking about sport more in general. We own a gym, and the gym is all about working with people who feel alienated from fitness and from sport and feel that there wasn't a space for them. 70% of our members report that they did not enjoy and were not good at PE at school. They have therefore not participated in physical activity throughout their whole adult life until they found us. The issue there is that they talk about being good. I don't think we need to be good. We just need to enjoy it. And that is about sports, like you said, just building that passion and building that enjoyment and not being focused on that skill set. And that's going to build healthier, happier communities and societies.
Any other? Got time for one more? Yep.
Thanks for a great discussion. I just wanted to follow on to that point. So for people that perhaps are not engaged in sport and haven't exercised for a long time, what kind of strategies are needed in communities to support people, to meet them where they're at and to help them gradually re-engage if they're fearful that they're not good enough?
We need to tackle the narrative, first of all, around not being good enough. And then we need to create inclusive spaces where people feel that they do have an opportunity to be there. And that's about removing that competition and removing all of those barriers. Because people, as soon as someone feels that they do not want to go to somewhere, they're going to find every single barrier, every single excuse possible. So it's our responsibility, from our perspective, in terms of the business that we run and the boards that we sit on for the local government, to remove all of those barriers and to support those people to go into it. Anyone else?
I think one of the big differences I've noticed between the way that British people approach sport and the way that we approach sport in Australia is that there tends to be not as strong of a community element to sport in this country, especially from a young age, but also all the way through. I think that massively changes attitudes towards sport if it's something normal that everyone in your community participates in at some point. It's a lot less about the standard that you're meeting and a lot more about just the fact that you're maybe meeting people and having fun and doing it as a social thing, not necessarily needing to be good at all. And I think that's something that is also important to focus on, especially in team sports, to get people back involved and moving and feeling like it's a space where it's worthwhile for them to spend the time on sport, even if that reason has nothing to do with the sport itself, but has to do with the people that they're playing with. And I think that is something that we could probably focus on as well a little bit more to get people back involved in playing sport and just giving it a go, really.
Awesome. I think we're at time now, but I think there are drinks afterwards, so feel free to come and find us if you've got any other questions and things like that. Thank you for being a great audience, but big round of applause for our panellists who have been amazing. And happy International Women's Day, everyone.